The sky rumbles as the engines roar, slicing through the heavy fog of war. In 1944, one plane would change the course of history. A machine that would strike fear into the hearts of enemy forces and become a symbol of unmatched power. But what made this aircraft truly unstoppable? The P-51 Mustang, WWII's fastest fighter, was not just a plane. It was a force of nature. With a legacy of destruction, speed, and precision, it earned its place as the king of the skies. This is the story of how it became a legend. The year was 1940. Europe burned under the relentless shadow of the Luftwaffe. Britain fought alone, and the skies were filled with the roar of German Messerschmitts and British Spitfires locked in deadly duels. The Allies desperately needed a fighter that could escort bombers deep into enemy territory, far beyond the reach of the Spitfire's fuel tanks. Pilots were dying, missions were failing, and morale was breaking. Then, almost by accident, a savior took shape, a sleek, silver aircraft born not in Britain, but across the ocean in America. The North American P-51 Mustang. The story began when the British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation to produce more Curtiss P-40s, but Dutch Kindleberger, head of NIA, refused. "We can build you something better," he promised. And he did. In just 117 days, engineers drafted, tested, and rolled out the first prototype. It was unlike any fighter seen before. Long wings, laminar flow design, and a frame built for both agility and endurance. But its heart, the early Allison engine, was its weakness. It could climb like a champion at low altitude, but gasped for air above 15,000 feet. A fatal flaw in European skies. At first, the Mustang was dismissed. Another good idea that couldn't quite make it. But fate, as in every war story, had other plans. In 1942, British engineers tried something bold. They fitted the Mustang with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that gave the Spitfire its soul. What happened next stunned the world. The Mustang's speed leapt beyond 440 miles per hour, and its range stretched over 1,000 miles. It could now fly from England to Berlin and back, fast, fierce, and unshakable. The American air commanders saw in the P-51 not just a fighter, but a revolution. It became the guardian angel of bomber crews who once called their long missions suicide runs. The Mustang would fly high above, circling like a hawk, diving at any enemy daring enough to strike. Luftwaffe aces who once ruled the sky began to fall one by one. The tables had turned. The hunter had become the hunted. For the young pilots who climbed into its cockpit, the Mustang was more than metal and rivets. It was life itself. It could climb higher, dive faster, and turn tighter than anything the enemy had. The 650 caliber Browning machine guns on its wings could shred anything that crossed their path. The sound of its engine became a melody of victory, a deep, throaty growl that echoed freedom. The Mustang had arrived too late to save the early bomber crews, but not too late to win the war. From the frozen air over Berlin to the burning skies of the Pacific, its silver wings carried the promise of survival. It wasn't just a plane. It was destiny in aluminum form, the weapon that would give the Allies control of the sky. By the winter of 1943, the skies above Europe had become graveyards of twisted metal and smoke. American B-17s and B-24s flew deep into German airspace, but their losses were staggering. Bombers were shredded by flak and swarmed by enemy fighters long before reaching their targets. The Luftwaffe owned the sky until the P-51 Mustang arrived. When the first squadrons of Mustangs appeared over Europe, they were met with disbelief. Luftwaffe pilots couldn't believe a single engine fighter could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. But this new predator didn't just escort, it hunted. With its long range and incredible speed, the Mustang changed the game. The German pilots, once so confident, now faced a new kind of enemy, one that could outfly, outclimb, and outfight them. The men who flew the Mustang were young, some barely 20 years old, yet they carried the weight of nations on their shoulders. They were known as the Sky Warriors. In squadrons like the 4th Fighter Group, the 352nd Blue-Nosed Bastards of Bodney, and the legendary 332nd Red Tails of the Tuskegee Airmen, these pilots became legends. Their call signs echoed across the radio waves: Big Beautiful Doll, Old Crow, Glamorous Glen, names that would soon be etched into history. Each mission began in darkness. Engines roared to life, the ground trembling beneath them as mechanics gave a final thumbs up. The Mustang's propeller spun, slicing through the cold morning air. The smell of oil and fuel mixed with fear, because every pilot knew not all would return. They climbed through the gray mist, forming up beside the lumbering bombers. The Mustangs were angels of death and guardians of hope, flying shotgun for thousands of men who trusted them with their lives. Over enemy territory, the real test began. The Luftwaffe's elite, flying FW-190s and Me-109s, would pounce from above like hawks. But the Mustang's Merlin engine sang a different tune. With a single push of the throttle, the P-51 could climb to meet them, roll over, and dive at 450 miles per hour. Guns blazing, 650 caliber Brownings tore through enemy wings and fuselages, leaving nothing but smoke trails spiraling toward the earth. The first major victory came when the Mustangs escorted the bombers to Berlin in early 1944, and all returned home. It was more than a triumph. It was a turning point. The Luftwaffe, once feared, was being hunted in its own sky. Day after day, Mustang squadrons shredded German defenses, sweeping the skies clean. For bomber crews watching from their windows, the sight of a silver Mustang overhead was salvation. "If we saw them, we knew we'd live," one pilot recalled. And for the Germans, the growl of that Merlin engine became a sound of doom, the sound of an empire collapsing from the sky downward. The Mustang wasn't just protecting bombers anymore. It was rewriting air warfare itself. Berlin, the heart of Nazi Germany, the city Hitler had sworn would never fall. By 1944, it was surrounded by fire in the skies. The P-51 Mustang had become the executioner of the Luftwaffe. Every mission into the blackened heart of Europe was a duel of life and death, and the men who flew those missions knew that one mistake could mean eternity in flames. Captain Clarence "Bud" Anderson, a pilot of the 357th Fighter Group, remembered his first sight of Berlin from the cockpit of his P-51, Old Crow. Below him, the city stretched like a wounded beast, smoke rising from the ruins, anti-aircraft fire reaching into the heavens. Above, a swarm of enemy fighters appeared, Me-109s and FW-190s diving with desperation. The Luftwaffe was outnumbered now, but not out of courage. What followed wasn't a battle. It was chaos, a storm of speed, steel, and fire. The Mustang's Merlin engine howled as Bud banked hard, turning into a German formation. Tracer fire streaked past his canopy, red lines of death cutting the air. He squeezed the trigger, and 650 caliber machine guns unleashed fury. One enemy fighter exploded in a cloud of flame, another spiraled down in smoke. But there was no time to celebrate. Another German was already behind him. He rolled inverted, dove, and felt the G-forces press his body into the seat. At 450 miles per hour, even a blink could kill. Across the sky, hundreds of duels played out at once. One of them was Lieutenant Chuck Yeager's, a young pilot from West Virginia who would one day break the sound barrier. On that day, he broke something else, the spirit of the Luftwaffe. Yeager spotted 5 Messerschmitts flying in formation. With cold precision, he stalked them from behind. He fired, 1 down, rolled right, 2 more. Within minutes, he had shot down 5 enemy planes in a single mission. When he landed, his hands were shaking, his fuel was gone, and his legend had just begun. The air over Berlin was no longer ruled by fear. It was ruled by skill, by innovation, by the pilots who refused to die quietly. The Mustang had given them wings strong enough to challenge the impossible. Even as anti-aircraft shells burst around them, the pilots pressed forward. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for victory. By the end of March 1944, something extraordinary happened. The Luftwaffe's best squadrons, once the terror of Europe, were shattered. Their aces were dead or captured. Their airfields were smoking craters. For the first time since the war began, the Allies owned the sky over Berlin. And as the Mustangs escorted the bombers home, the young pilots looked down at the burning capital of the Reich, not with triumph, but with silence. They knew what it had cost. The Mustang had given them power beyond imagination, but every roar of its engine carried the ghosts of those who never made it back. While the P-51 Mustang dominated the skies of Europe, another battle was being fought, not just against the Luftwaffe, but against prejudice itself. Far from the European front lines, in the segregated America of the 1940s, a group of young black men trained to fly. They were told they couldn't, that they shouldn't, and that they weren't capable. But at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama, these men, the Tuskegee Airmen, proved the world wrong. They were called Red Tails because of the crimson paint on the tails of their Mustangs, a mark of pride and identity. Their unit, the 302nd Fighter Group, was formed under constant doubt and scrutiny. Even as they trained, whispers spread that they'd never make it to combat. But they did, and when they did, they rewrote history. When the Red Tails first arrived in Italy in 1944, they faced skepticism from white bomber crews. Some pilots didn't want colored escorts, but that would change. On their first major missions escorting B-17s over Germany, the Red Tails never abandoned a single bomber to enemy fighters. While other units broke formation to chase kills, the Tuskegee Airmen stayed loyal to their oath: protect the bombers at all costs. In the air, they were artists of war. Their P-51 Mustangs glowed with red tails, cutting through the blue sky, a sight that soon became both feared and loved. German pilots learned to recognize them and dreaded their presence. The Red Tails flew with precision, discipline, and courage. Major Lee Archer, one of their best, shot down 5 German planes, becoming an ace in an era when many doubted a black pilot could even fly one. Each mission they flew was a statement, not just of military strength, but of equality. They fought 2 wars at once, one against fascism abroad and another against racism at home. When they returned from missions, covered in sweat and gunpowder, they were still denied service in military canteens. But they never broke. Their bravery spoke louder than words, and even the bomber crews who once doubted them began to request, "Give us the Red Tails." On one mission in March 1945, the Tuskegee Airmen escorted bombers deep into enemy territory near Berlin. The Luftwaffe attacked in waves, sending jet-powered Me-262s, the fastest fighters of the war. Yet even against jets, the Red Tails fought back fiercely, downing several. When the bombers returned safely, their commanders radioed a simple message: "Those red-tailed angels saved our lives." By war's end, the Tuskegee Airmen had flown over 15,000 sorties and destroyed more than 250 enemy aircraft. But their greatest victory wasn't just in numbers, it was in changing minds. They shattered the barriers of doubt and prejudice, earning respect that no law or decree could grant. The Red Tails didn't just defend bombers, they defended dignity. And in the black and white skies of Wutu, their red tails blazed a trail of color, courage, and hope that still burns bright today. By the final year of the war, the air above Europe was changing. The thunder of propellers began to share the sky with something new, a sharp, unnatural whine, like a scream from the future. It came from Germany's desperate gamble, the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was fast, too fast, and it terrified Allied pilots. The Me-262 could fly over 540 miles per hour, almost 100 meters per hour faster than the P-51 Mustang. It was sleek, silver, and deadly. Hitler called it his Wunderwaffe, the miracle weapon that would turn the tide. But the Mustang was about to prove that skill, courage, and timing could still defeat technology. In the spring of 1945, the 8th Air Force began reporting sightings of the strange, jet-propelled aircraft cutting through their bomber formations. The jets would appear suddenly, fire their cannons, and vanish before anyone could react. The bombers were helpless. The Mustangs, however, adapted quickly. Pilots learned to hunt the Me-262s, not in the air, but on the ground, catching them during takeoff or landing when their engines were weakest. It was a new kind of hunting, one that required patience and precision. Captain Chuck Yeager and his fellow pilots of the 357th Fighter Group led some of the first successful counterattacks. They discovered that the Me-262's jet engines, while fast, were fragile. They overheated easily, took forever to accelerate, and couldn't turn sharply. If you could make them fight your fight, Yeager recalled, you could kill them, and the P-51 could always turn tighter. One cold morning over Germany, a flight of Mustangs spotted 4 Me-262s diving toward a bomber stream. Yeager led the chase, pushing his Merlin engine to the limit. The sky tore open with noise. The jets streaked ahead, but as one began its descent to land, Yeager closed in. He lined up the gun sight, held his breath, and fired. The tracers ripped through the air, tearing into the jet's fuselage. The Me-262 exploded in a fireball just as its wheels touched the runway. It was the first recorded kill of a jet by a propeller-driven fighter, and proof that the future wasn't invincible. Across Germany, the story repeated itself. The Mustang pilots learned to outthink the jets, using their endurance and agility. They couldn't match speed, but they could wait, circling above enemy airfields, ready to pounce when the jets slowed to land. The Germans called them Luftplage, the air plague, because wherever a jet tried to rise, a Mustang was already waiting. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe's last hope had burned away. The Me-262s, powerful but too few, couldn't change what had already been decided. The Mustang had done more than dominate the skies. It had faced the next generation of warfare and still emerged victorious. The age of the jet had dawned, but the Mustang's roar still echoed, a reminder that courage and mastery could outrun even the future itself. By early 1945, the war was nearing its breaking point, but for the bomber crews, every mission still felt like gambling with death. High above the clouds, they flew in tight formations of silver giants, B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 liberators, their bellies filled with bombs meant to cripple the German war machine. The air was freezing, -40 degrees, and the gunners sat in glass turrets with frost on their eyelashes, waiting for the enemy to appear. And then, like clockwork, came the hunters, the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. The bombers braced for the storm. But then a new sound filled the air. A deep, rolling growl, the sound of salvation. The P-51 Mustangs had arrived. They came out of the sun, wings flashing silver, engines screaming through the sky. To the men inside those bombers, the sight of a Mustang meant life. "When you saw that long nose and those red or blue tails," one B-17 pilot said, "you could breathe again." The bomber crews called them the Guardians of the Sky. Escort missions were not glamorous. They were long, brutal, and filled with invisible danger. Mustang pilots had to maintain formation with the bombers for hours, fighting fatigue, cold, and the constant threat of ambush. Their eyes scanned every cloud, every glint of sunlight, knowing death could strike from anywhere. They couldn't afford distraction. The bombers' survival depended on their vigilance. For many, the bond between bomber and fighter was deeply personal. Mustang pilots often knew the men inside those bombers, men they ate with, joked with, wrote letters beside. Protecting them wasn't just a duty, it was a promise. When a bomber went down in flames, pilots would circle the wreckage, calling names over the radio that no one would answer. And when they returned to base with empty spots in the formation, there were no words, just silence and smoke from their engines. But more often, they succeeded. With every mission, the Mustangs carved corridors of safety across enemy skies. They dove into German formations, scattering enemy fighters before they could reach the bombers. Their speed and precision were unmatched. They didn't just fight. They anticipated. The Germans began to fear them, calling them the long-nosed devils. One pilot, Colonel Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group, put it best: "The bomber boys had guts. We just made sure they had a chance to show it." Under his command, Mustang squadrons achieved record kills, escorting bombers on over 1,000-mile missions with minimal losses. By the war's end, the Mustangs had made good on their promise. The bomber crews returned, weary but alive. Many would later say they owed their lives not to luck, but to those silver-winged angels that never let them die alone. The P-51 wasn't just a fighter. It was a brotherhood in metal, a bond between sky warriors who fought not for glory, but for each other. When the war finally ended in 1945, the skies over Europe grew quiet for the first time in years. The thunder of engines, the whistle of bombs, the rattle of gunfire, all fell into silence. For the pilots of the P-51 Mustang, that silence was deafening. They had spent years living by the heartbeat of their engines, where every sunrise meant another mission and every sunset meant survival. Now there were no more missions to fly. The war that had defined them was over. Airfields across England and Italy were littered with Mustangs lined wing to wing, their paint scorched and their fuselages scarred by flak. The once mighty machines that ruled the sky now sat still, like sleeping lions. Pilots packed their few belongings, a flight jacket, a logbook, a photograph folded from home, and prepared to go back to a world that could never understand what they had seen. For men like Bud Anderson, Chuck Yeager and George Preddy, the return home was bittersweet. They were heroes, yes, but they carried ghosts that no medal could silence. They remembered the empty chairs in the mess hall, the radio calls that ended in static, the smoke trails disappearing into the clouds. For every victory they had claimed, there was a friend who hadn't made it back. The celebrations back home were loud, parades, flags, and music. But inside, many pilots felt hollow. The Mustang had become part of their soul, its engine note etched into their memories. Some pilots said they could still hear it in their dreams, that steady Merlin growl rising from the horizon. They missed the sky, not the killing, not the fear, but the feeling of being infinite. Up there, they had purpose. Down here, they were just men again. The red tails returned to a country still divided by color. Despite their heroism, the Tuskegee Airmen were not greeted as equals. They had fought for freedom abroad, only to face prejudice at home. Yet they stood proud. Their record spoke for itself. They had never lost a single bomber under their protection. Their quiet dignity in the face of injustice became a new kind of courage. For the rest of the Mustang pilots, civilian life felt too quiet, too slow. Some became commercial pilots. Others couldn't bear the silence and re-enlisted. A few, like Yeager, continued to fly, pushing into a new age of flight where the jet replaced the propeller. But they all knew nothing would ever feel like the P-51 again. In air shows years later, when a restored Mustang would thunder overhead, veterans would stop mid-conversation, eyes glistening. That sound wasn't just nostalgia, it was remembrance. It was the echo of comrades, of missions, of youth that never truly came home. The war had ended. But for the men who flew the Mustang, a part of them remained forever at 20,000 feet, chasing the horizon in a sky that no longer burned. Long after the guns of Europe went silent, engineers, historians, and pilots still spoke the name Mustang with reverence. It wasn't just another fighter plane. It was a masterpiece of design, a fusion of daring engineering and battlefield necessity that changed air combat forever. The P-51 Mustang wasn't born from luck. It was born from brilliance. Every line of its frame told a story of innovation. Its most revolutionary feature was the laminar flow wing, a sleek design that reduced drag and allowed it to slice through the air with unmatched efficiency. This wasn't just theory, it was physics perfected. The Mustang could fly faster, farther, and smoother than any fighter of its generation. Combined with drop tanks, it could travel over 1,600 kilometers without refueling, a range that made deep escort bombing missions possible for the first time. Then came the heart of the legend, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. When the British suggested fitting the Mustang with the same engine that powered the Spitfire, it changed everything. The Merlin transformed it from a decent low-altitude fighter into a high-altitude killer. The engine's supercharger allowed it to climb to 40,000 feet, and its power-to-weight ratio gave it lightning reflexes. It could dive like a bullet and recover before the pilot even broke a sweat. But the Mustang wasn't just about numbers, it was about feel. Pilots described it as alive. The controls were smooth, perfectly balanced and intuitive. The moment a pilot sat in the cockpit, he didn't feel like he was flying a machine. He felt like he was the machine. It responded like an extension of thought. That harmony between man and metal was what made it unbeatable. The 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns mounted in its wings delivered brutal precision. Each could fire at 750 rounds per minute, capable of ripping through aircraft, armor, and even locomotives. German pilots often said that if a Mustang was behind you, there was no escape, only seconds left to prey. Its devastating firepower and range allowed it to dominate dogfights, destroy trains, strafe convoys, and clear skies for Allied bombers. But beyond the weaponry and speed, the Mustang represented something deeper, the shift from defensive to offensive air strategy. Before it, bombers could never reach their targets without heavy losses. After it, the Allies owned the air. Air superiority wasn't just a military advantage, it was a moral one. The Mustang gave the Allies freedom to strike anywhere, anytime, with confidence. Even after the war, the Mustang refused to die. It fought again in Korea, served in over 20 air forces worldwide, and became the foundation for future aircraft design. Engineers studying its aerodynamics would later help shape jet fighters and even early spacecraft. The P-51 wasn't merely a tool of destruction. It was a symbol of human ingenuity, a reminder that brilliance, courage, and relentless pursuit of perfection can turn the tide of history. In every way, the Mustang was not just a plane. It was the dawn of modern aviation. Decades after the guns of war fell silent, the sound of a Merlin engine still turns heads. That deep, throaty roar doesn't just echo across the airfields of history, it lives. The P-51 Mustang, born in the fires of World War II, never truly retired. It transcended time. From warbird museums to modern air shows, the Mustang still rules the skies, a living legend made of aluminum, courage, and memory. When pilots of later generations first flew it, they described the same feeling their forebears did, awe. The P-51 wasn't like the jets that came after, sterile, mechanical, detached. The Mustang was raw, alive, and untamed. Flying one was like holding lightning on a leash. Every vibration, every sound was personal. Its controls weren't just levers and dials, they were whispers between man and machine. In the years after the war, thousands of Mustangs were sold to Allied nations or civilians. They served in air forces across the world, in Sweden, Australia, Israel, and South Korea. Even in conflicts like the Korean War, when jets dominated the air, Mustangs were still called back into service for ground attack and reconnaissance. They were durable, dependable, and lethal, proof that true design never becomes obsolete. By the 1960s, as the last operational Mustangs were decommissioned, a new generation of pilots, civilians, and war veterans alike began restoring them. They became prized warbirds, lovingly rebuilt bolt by bolt, their polished aluminum reflecting the sunlight of peace instead of war. Today, only a few hundred remain airworthy, each one worth millions. But no price can measure what they represent, a bridge between the past and the sky itself. At air shows around the world, in Oshkosh, Duxford, and Chino, people gather to watch the Mustangs take off. When their engines ignite, the crowd falls silent. The propeller spins, the Merlin screams, and suddenly time folds. It's 1944 again. Somewhere, high above the clouds, a bomber formation flies, and a silver guardian keeps watch, pilots who fly restored Mustangs speak with reverence. "You don't fly it," one said. "You become it." Many paint their aircraft with the same nose art as the originals. Old Crow, Glamorous Glen, Big Beautiful Doll, keeping alive the memory of those who never came home. The names, the colors, the roar, they're not nostalgia. They're remembrance. The P-51. Mustang's legacy isn't just mechanical, it's emotional. It reminds humanity that technology is only as great as the spirit behind it. It represents precision forged from chaos, courage shaped by fear, and hope born from destruction. Even now, when a Mustang streaks across the sky, veterans look up, their eyes glistening. To them, it's not just a plane. It's a ghost from the past, saluting from above. The world may have moved on, but the Mustang still flies, proud, defiant, eternal, a shimmering reminder that some legends never land. The world changed after the war, but the sound of the Mustang's Merlin never truly faded. For decades, it remained a symbol of courage, and of the men who refused to surrender to fear. Time aged the pilots, but not the memory. The young men who once gripped the throttle with steady hands now carried canes and medals. Yet their eyes still flickered with that same spark, the light of the open sky. On anniversaries of great battles, Berlin, Normandy, D-Day, the veterans would gather. Their hair white, their voices soft, but their stories sharper than ever. As the airshow announcer's voice echoed through the crowd, all eyes turned to the runway. And then it came, that unmistakable growl of 12 cylinders. The P-51 Mustang lifted off the ground once more, sunlight glinting off its silver wings. The crowd gasped, and the old pilot stood a little taller. Some saluted, others simply whispered a name, a friend long gone, lost to the clouds of war. Above them, the Mustang banked gracefully, the same way it had over Berlin, Rome and Tokyo, but this time, there were no enemies, no traces, no fear, just wind, sound, and memory. The aircraft looped once, twice, and then leveled out, flying low and steady across the field. It wasn't just a performance. It was a farewell. For many, that flight was more than nostalgia. It was closure. The plane that had carried them through chaos now carried their stories into eternity. In museums and hangars, the P-51s stood polished and proud, their paint restored, their guns silent and no longer instruments of war, but monuments of peace. Children pressed their faces to the glass, reading names stenciled on the fuselage: Old Crow, Glamorous Glen, Ferocious Frankie, names that once thundered over nations, now whispering lessons of bravery and sacrifice. The Mustang's story did not end in 1945. It lived on in every aircraft that came after it, from the F-86 Sabre to the F-16 Fighting Falcon. Its design principles, its aerodynamic genius, and its perfect balance between power and grace became the DNA of modern aviation. Every fighter jet that takes off today carries a spark of the Mustang spirit. And even now, when one rises into the blue, you can still imagine that young pilot, goggles down, jaw set, eyes fixed on the horizon. You can still hear that same engine cry, not in anger, but in remembrance. The Mustang does not fly for war anymore. It flies for those who can't. The P-51 Mustang is more than metal, more than history. It's a reminder that freedom has wings, that courage has a sound, and that even when heroes fall, their stories never truly touch the ground. So the next time you hear that deep rolling roar overhead, look up. Somewhere in that sound lives every pilot who once soared through smoke and fire, every man who believed that victory was worth the sky itself, because legends don't rest in museums, they fly.